Good afternoon. My name is Elisa Boklich. I'm the director of the Center for Philosophy and History of Science here at Boston University. And I would like to welcome you back to part 2 of our session devoted to the 50th anniversary of the center. As I mentioned this morning, we have a number of exciting colloquia planned, and we encourage you to visit our website. There are many more coming throughout the year. Our website is bu.edu/CPHS. We also have copies of our poster in the back that tells more about our upcoming colloquia. We have 3 terrific speakers lined up for this afternoon, and I'd like to mention that the final talk will be followed by a champagne reception. So I hope that you can all stick around and join me in toasting the center on its 50th anniversary following the final talk today. Our first speaker this afternoon is Alan Richardson, who is a professor in the philosophy department at the University of British Columbia. He is the founding member and current president of the International Society for the History of Philosophy of Science, or HOPOS, as it is fondly referred to. He's also a member of the Vienna Circle Institute and author of several books, including Carnap's Construction of the World and co-editor of the Cambridge Companion to Logical Empiricism. Professor Richardson will be speaking to us today on American philosophers of science at work in the 1950s, Philipp, Ernst Nagel, and the prospects for an empirical history of philosophy of science in America. Please join me in welcoming Professor Richardson.
Thank you. There's all sorts of equipment up here. It's very good to be here, obviously. Thanks for the invitation to participate in this 50th anniversary event for the Boston Center for the Philosophy and History of Science. If I understand why Professor Boklich invited me here today, given that I am only temperamentally associated with the center, it was to consider the following sort of question. Suppose celebrations like this one, or the recent 50th anniversary celebration of the Indiana University History and Philosophy of Science Department, were not merely occasions for local festivities or moments of, as Thomas Kuhn might have said, chronology and anecdote, but were instead serious aspects of an ongoing project of the history of philosophy. What would we learn from such histories? That is to say, I'm here to spread the gospel of HOPOS, which I'm actually the past president. Laura Snyder will be unhappy to know that she's been deposed. She's been worried about that for some time. We have the editor of the New HOPOS Journal, Rosemary Sargent, in the back. We've got a few copies of the call for papers, this nice, that says HOPOS. That's what it's going to look like. It's coming out as of spring 2011. Submit papers. And really what I'm here to do is tell you that you should listen to Heather when she comes up and starts to talk. Because she's done hard work, and I'm just going to talk about what it would be to do hard work if you did it. Suppose the history of philosophy took seriously not just the thoughts and words of philosophers, but also the institutions that they created and from which they offered those thoughts and words. Or the learned societies and journals they founded to promote certain sorts of thoughts and words. What would we learn about the practice of philosophy and how it has developed? For, as we know, the sensibilities of philosophers often lead them to overlook anniversaries of the founding moments and subsequent life of institutions. Heather, can you get my water, please? Such as the one we are, thank you, celebrating here. Thank you. Philosophers are more likely to celebrate 100 years of Russell and Whitehead's Principia Mathematica than 75 years of the journal Philosophy of Science, just to mention one celebration that has happened this year and one that didn't happen last year. If I were to diagnose the root causes of this lack of celebratory impulse, I'd point to 2 things, just bracketing the third thing, which is the bad manners of philosophers. First, philosophy is still very much a discipline that celebrates individual achievement. It is easy to know whom and what we are celebrating when celebrating Principia Mathematica. Bertrand Russell, occasionally and rather reluctantly Alfred North Whitehead, and their specific intervention in the founding of modern logic. and modern analytic philosophy. But who are we celebrating when we celebrate the journal Philosophy of Science, and for what are we celebrating them? The founding of the journal in 1934 and in the years running up to 1934 was, as is often the case, the joint work of a considerable cast of characters, and we have barely begun to figure out who did what in that story. What role did the journal have in creating the community of philosophical researchers from which we, current philosophers of science, draw our philosophical nourishment and inspiration? That is a good question, but it's also one that's very hard to answer, compared to asking the same question about, for example, Principia Mathematica. More importantly, and secondly, we have an almost entirely text, idea, argument-based understanding of the history of philosophy. We have a good sense of the significance of Principia Mathematica in the history of philosophical thought. We've chewed that over quite a bit in the last 100 years. We have very little idea how even to think about other aspects of the philosophical landscape. We generally ignore institutions, centers, departments, despite our current mania for ranking such things, research organizations, professional groups, and so forth when thinking about the history of philosophy. We have a hard time even thinking of texts as anything other than vehicles for thought. That is, we have a hard time thinking about the social and material life of texts. Next year, for example, we might muster a conference or two celebrating the 75th anniversary of the English translation of Carnap's Logical Syntax of Language. But how many papers in such conferences will pause to consider that the English translation came out in the publisher Routledge and Kegan-Paul's series, the International Library of Psychology, Philosophy, and Scientific Method? That series included, in addition to Wittgenstein's Tractatus, the English translation, Russell's Analysis of Matter and Frank Ramsey's Foundations of Mathematics, also English translations of, for example, Hans Weyer, Friedrich Lange, and Eduard von Hartmann, and also included work in psychological and social science by people like Piaget, Malinowski, von Uexküll, and Jung, and also work that came to be fundamental texts in textual hermeneutics, such as C.K. Ogden and I.A. Richards' Meaning of Meaning, and Richards' Principles of Literary Criticism, all in the same series. C.K. Ogden was the general editor of the series, and there's potentially a whole history to tell of the project behind that series, which certainly stands with the Encyclopedia of Unified Science and other Vienna-based publication series in historical significance for 20th century analytic philosophy, and I rather suspect outstrips the encyclopedia, certainly, both in breadth of intellectual vision and, if I could hazard a guess, sales. After all, it's got the Tractatus in it. So, history of philosophy tends to work like this, as we know. Attend to the arguments given and projects announced and carried forward in, say, Carnap's essay, Testability and Meaning, but do not attend to the venue in which it was published, namely the Journal of Philosophy of Science. The process of historical reconstruction is, that is to say, almost entirely the reverse of standard practices of promotion and tenure in philosophy, where you usually care about the venues and not about the arguments. Such remarks might seem flip, and I hope they do. But I do think that we should consider the disconnection between the priorities of our day-to-day professional lives and the terms in which we write the history of philosophy, including the history of the increasingly professionalized worlds of 19th and 20th century philosophy. The greatest disconnection is, of course, this. In any given week, the largest number of hours we spend doing philosophy in the company of others is spent in the company of students in philosophy classrooms. But you can read entire books in the history of philosophy dedicated to people who were philosophy professors without learning a single thing about how they taught, what they thought philosophy teaching was for, how such teaching informed their research, and so on. And this is not just a matter of individual idiosyncrasies, it's a matter of curriculum. Philosophy teaching in various fields actually has an interesting historical relation to things like textbook traditions, which Kuhn told us to think about in the case of science. For example, some fields such as logic maintain a textbook tradition right across great divergences in content and form. Just look at the textbooks used in your college or university in the 1920s versus in the 1930s. While other fields have seen textbooks come and go. Or to take another example, one reason we tend to have 3 to 6 great philosophers every century is that the courses we teach in the history of those centuries run 10 to 15 weeks, and that's all that we can fit in. That's why Malebranche is not a great philosopher anymore. Having said that, I ask you to attend to the first keyword in my overly long title. I needed lots of keywords, hence the length of the title. The first keyword I want to draw your attention to is prospects. I have not done any of my own original research into the founding and development of the Boston Center. What I know about it, I've learned largely from people such as the people we've heard from this morning, and from archival work done by a few others, such as George Reich in his book, How the Cold War Transformed Philosophy of Science. George Reich is someone who deeply understands the importance of institutions, professional organizations, publication series, and so on in the history of philosophy, certainly in the history of 20th century philosophy. Being who I am, although I found much valuable material in George's work, being who I am, I will have occasion to disagree fairly sharply with some aspects of Reich's story. However heavily I do rely on his scholarship. I think the narrative framework of Reich's book, which I urge everyone to read, but despite the fact that I'm about to diss it, criticize it. The narrative framework of Reich's story is, I think, misleading, because this whole movement in the American context of formalization and technicalization of philosophy of science is given in Reich's story an almost entirely, if I can use these terms, external, political, Cold War explanation. I think there are alternative explanations that need to be looked at, and I'll mention one at the end of what I have to say here. Since I have begun to unpack my title, let me say 2 more things by way of unpacking it further and drawing out my intentions. It is so long, my title, because it bears the burden of 2 references to actual philosophical writing. The first, although it is second in the title, is to John Dewey's 1935 essay, An Empirical Survey of Empiricisms. The other reference is to a volume published in 1956 under the editorship of Sidney Hook and entitled The American Philosopher at Work. The Hook volume, besides giving me the chance to see the look on various faces when I utter the name Sidney Hook, provides a clue to my subject matter. I'm interested in what philosophers, especially philosophers of science, were doing in the post-war period, right up through the time of the founding and flourishing of centers like this one. Philosophy of science became institutionalized in the United States in just this period. We see the founding of, as was mentioned, the Minnesota Center for Philosophy of Science under Herbert Feigl in the early 50s, the Boston Center here under Marx Mortowski and Robert S. Cohen, the Pittsburgh Center under Adolf Grunbaum, the Pittsburgh and Indiana departments, and so on. Work to establish such an institutional presence is not done by philosophers who understand that their only task is to write essays and books. Among the real items of work done by philosophers in the 1950s and 60s was work in creating the professional place of philosophy of science, a unique place, as far as I can tell, within analytic philosophy of that period. I've been trying to scratch my head to think about whether there was ever in this period even an attempt to create, let alone succeed at creating, a Center for Philosophy of Language, for example. The Dewey reference is for me methodological, or perhaps simply hortatory. In that essay, An Empirical Survey of Empiricisms, Dewey thought of himself as providing a more empirical history of philosophy. I don't wish to take a stand on how right he was in that self-assessment, but I do appreciate the sentiment. For a group of people proudly assertive of their general empiricism, philosophers of science in particular tend to wax positively idealistic in their historiographic sensibilities. the philosophy of science, history of philosophy of science is standardly pursued, as I've said, as the history of ideas, arguments, methods, sometimes vaguely described intellectual movements, and so forth. Anyone who announces that they have a genuine interest in, say, philosophical institutions, organizations, textbooks, curricula, and the like, tends to be viewed with suspicion. Such a person has clearly become an historian, with the little word mere that philosophers like to put in front of the word historian, either implicit or explicit. In the worst cases, such a person might even become a sociologist. Which is to say that for philosophers, the history of philosophy is a way to do philosophy, not a way to do history, which is fine. But it is precisely the presuppositions packed into that distinction between what it is to be a philosopher and what it is to be a historian that Dewey was seeking to complicate and disrupt. Suppose that it is not the case that you can adequately understand the philosophical projects of even the great philosophers, unless you know something about their cultural, social, and material circumstances, which is, after all, a consequence of taking Dewey seriously. Then, history of philosophy becomes philosophically the more robust, the more it becomes immersed in the details of specific intellectual projects, of specific people living in specific places in specific times. That is a sentiment remote from most philosophers, and I don't mean to argue for it here on grounds that most philosophers would accept. I certainly don't wish to give a general argument for it. Maybe some who are already appreciative of Dewey's overall philosophical outlook will recognize an argument in what I do offer in my time here, namely an exploration of the sentiment of doing an empirical history of philosophy of science in America with an eye towards showing some consequences that it might have for our understanding of our own history. Now, an empirical history of philosophy of science in mid-century America of the sort I'm considering must still be history. That is to say, while it will be interested in a variety of things that historians of philosophy ordinarily don't spend much time thinking about, it certainly needs to be more than a heap of facts. History, so it seems to me, should have structure, and that structure should explain something. The idea, argument, text-based histories we tend to have are mainly interested in teasing out the details of the positions taken on philosophical issues by philosophers we maintain an interest in. This often has the salutary benefit of showing that the views of a given philosopher or set of philosophers are more interesting, subtle, even plausible than what we thought them to be. And certainly I've engaged in this activity myself. But that is a long way from having an historical explanation of the trajectory of philosophical development. Indeed, the effect of much work on the details of specific philosophers' views tends to take us down the path of an error theory of philosophical development. Much of the 19th century on such a view was predicated on misunderstanding Kant. Much of the 20th century, it's given over to misapplying Russell's techniques in pursuit of problems taken over from a misread Hume, or to reestablish a metaphysical project in line with a Leibniz denuded of all his scientific and theological concerns. The engine of progress in philosophy is a misunderstanding of its own past. Now, such a view may not be entirely wrong. It could well be that a misunderstood Kant is much more productive than the actual Kant for subsequent philosophy. That's probably true. But surely that is not all of the story, and the sort of empirical institutional history I have in mind here adds a positive engine for history to this negative one. Such institutionalized places and venues for philosophical work provide a rich, shared locus for the promotion of particular sorts of work. People like Herbert Feigl and Philipp Frank knew what they were doing. They were creating a space to promote certain sorts of work in philosophy in venues such as the Boston Studies, ultimately, or the Minnesota Studies in philosophy of science. Feigl was instrumental in training at least one generation of analytic philosophers with his textbook anthologies, edited jointly with Wilfrid Sellers and May Broadbeck, respectively, Readings in Philosophical Analysis and Readings in Philosophy of Science, which were almost universally read, if I'm to believe my elders, when studying for a PhD in philosophy in the 1960s. I can perhaps make the point by looking in a bit more detail at Hooke's 1956 anthology, The American Philosopher at Work. The title is not accidental. Hooke's foreword to the book is suffused with anxiety about the place of philosophy in American life. Philosophers are not class peripheral parasites or mere luxury items. Philosophers did work. The volume, Hooke went on to say in his foreword, gave, quote, representative American philosophers an opportunity to present their own selections from their writings to reveal them, so to speak, at work. The fact that it shows American philosophers in work clothes rather than in holiday dress makes more authentic the evidence of what they are thinking and how, unquote. We are presented with, then, in the book, for example, Rudolf Carnap in his overalls riveting together a philosophical automobile in the form of his chosen essay, Meaning and Synonymy in Natural Language. Or Nelson Goodman writing about the Aufbau. The paper that ultimately comes out in the Schulp volume on Carnap is first presented to the world in slightly shortened form in this volume. It is hard to know. That is to say, you show that philosophers are workers by showing that they produce polished pieces of professional work. It is hard to know who outside the philosophical world, who outside the professional domain of philosophy, who after all were the intended audience for this book, profited from this book. The papers don't have anything to do with one another, for one thing. Compare this to a similar question about the contemporary American scientist offered by James Bryan Conant in his General Sciences Education program at Harvard, the related series of case studies in experimental science, and in books like Science and Common Sense from 1951. Conant did not think that you explain the work of scientists by producing a volume of such work. Instead, you looked into the laboratory conditions, historical and contemporary, that made such work possible in the first place. Conant was, in my terms, far more attuned than was Hooke to the need to look at the material preconditions of the possibility of intellectual work, if I can wax Kantian. And I can, trust me. So if we look to the 1940s, the 50s, and the early 60s for philosophers of science doing the sort of institution building and alliance producing work that allowed philosophy of science to become a central project in American philosophy and American intellectual life, one sees several people coming to the fore over and over again. Feigl is certainly among them. But so too are the two people in my title, Ernest Nagel and Philipp Frank. Nagel and Frank seem to be all over the eastern seaboard in this period, cropping up wherever there's an opportunity to put the voice of philosophy of science into a larger conversation. Of course, there are others, as we've already heard about this morning. Adolf Grünbaum, the founder of the Pittsburgh Center, and under whose auspices the Philosophy of Science Association began in 1968 to meet separately from the American Association for the Advancement of Science, when in 1968 they met for the first time in Pittsburgh. Philipp Frank's efforts in such matters are truly notable, and we've heard more detail about them already today than I can give, but I just want to remind you of a few things, some of which were not mentioned this morning. In addition to his local work, running the Institute for the Unity of Science, and providing aid ultimately through this institution to the Philosophy of Science Association and sort of intellectual work towards the founding of this center at Boston University, doing his own teaching, his own research, and so forth, Frank organized many conferences, was the PSA's first president after its reorganization of its bylaws in 1947, and in that office was instrumental in PSA's participation in the meetings with Section L of the AAAS. He participated in the New York conferences on science and religion throughout the 1940s, leading to the publication of his book, Relativity, A Richer Truth, worked toward the establishment within the National Science Foundation of the program in history and philosophy of science. In all of these efforts, as we've already heard, his intellectual reach was unusually broad. For example, the conference on the validation of scientific theories contained papers by philosophers of science of various stripes. Frank himself, Gustav Bergmann, Karl Hempel, Adolf Grünbaum, but also Robert S. Cohen, C. West Churchman, Richard Rudner, and Michael Scriven, but also papers by historians such as the historian of psychology Boring, E.G. Boring, Alexander Coiré, Henry Gerlach, scientists from Percy Bridgman and Henry Margenau to Ilse Frankel Brunswick and B.F. Skinner, and also to Wolfgang Kohler and Warren McCulloch, as well as the Sovietologist Barrington Moore. This conference was sponsored by Frank's Institute for the Unity of Science, by the AAAS, by the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and by the Philosophy of Science Association. While his outreach was considerable and his pluralistic sensibilities never wavered, in his own work, Frank held true to his version of the logical empiricist project. Throughout it, he offered a vision of his version of a positivist view of history, with this twist. The seemingly plausible demand of science to speak to and be intelligible to common sense is one of the faces of metaphysics. For common sense is the name given to petrified scientific theorizing turned into dogmatic metaphysics. The proper demand for scientific intelligibility does not raise such learned common sense to the status of an ultimate arbiter of scientific thought. On Frank's view, which he sketched in many places, science works by a free and creative postulation of symbol systems that were then arduously connected to the world and language of ordinary experience by complicated chains of logic and mathematics and of experiment and measurement. The intervention of demands for intelligibility of scientific principles independently of those long complicated chains, intelligibility to common sense, is an attempt to short-circuit the work of science. These demands take the form of metaphysical constraints or of metaphysical interpretations of science, but they are really based on misunderstanding the symbolic nature of scientific, indeed of all language. Frank ended his retirement essay, and I have my copy of the dateless issue in which these essays are printed. Frank ended his retirement essay on this very point. Quoting now from Frank, "Non-scientists often believe that science consists in making observations and accumulating experience. But this image misses the point. At every moment of our lives, we perceive the data of experience. Yet by recording them, we do not get science. Science begins only when we invent a system of symbols, which can bring order into our experience. For building up science, the creation of words and their syntax is as important as experiments." Unquote. It is easy enough to see here some of the characteristic themes of logical empiricist philosophy of science: a concern with theories as linguistic or syntactic entities, a concern with the logical relations of the theoretical language of those theories, and the language of experience. The claim that there is creative freedom in the activity of scientific theorizing combined with an epistemic responsibility in science to ensure a strict connection back to the shared language of experience. But this view is presented in the particular Machian setting of Frank's larger project. Frank insists on these aspects of science so that we will set aside certain worries about a direct translation of scientific theories into a language of common sense. a language which is really, as I've said, a learned language of a previous stage of scientific understanding. This setting allows us to see why, despite treading so closely to Carnap's view of philosophy of science, Frank ultimately does dissociate himself from what he deems, in his 1957 textbook, overly formalistic philosophy of science. The key locus of Frank's rejection of metaphysics, as I read it, is not that metaphysical claims are pseudo-claims that cannot be reconstructed in scientific language, but that they form misguided, often deeply conservative methodological demands on the activity of scientific theorizing itself, which is not to say that such principles, demands for intelligibility to some form of common sense, cannot serve, in fact, to constrain scientific theorizing, but that they need not. And when they are made in the form of demands, rather than expressed in the form of values, they overstep their bounds. You root out metaphysics on this Frankian picture by providing a reconstruction of the history of science, science historisch kritisch dargestellt, one might say, that shows how explanatory principles of one stage of science become constraints on the practice of science that must be overcome in the progress of science. This does not merely allow, it requires, given the underdetermination problem, a role for values in theory choice. But it undermines all claims that seek to be permanent and absolute constraints or absolute values on what is scientifically acceptable. In reminding us a bit of Frank's professional activities, as well as the content, a bit of the content of his philosophy of science, I do mean to be arguing against the claim in George Reich's book that the Cold War era in the late 40s and through the 50s saw a marginalization of Frank in philosophy of science. And I mean to disagree with Reich on two counts. First, if we follow Reich's own historical practice and attend to the variety of roles that someone can play in the establishment and maintenance of a research field, we can see that Frank had a central place in the American philosophical community. He was an organizer and an ambassador. He wasn't so much, as far as I can tell, pushed off the pages of the journal Philosophy of Science as seeking to deploy the resources of philosophy of science in different venues. Much of his work was precisely the sort of material precondition of the work of others that I have been pointing to. The behind-the-scenes work that helped to create the National Science Foundation History and Philosophy of Science program is an interesting case in point. Notes taken by Ernest Nagel, who served on the adjudication committee, show that in 1958, the 1958 adjudication decisions, in those decisions, the philosophers dominated, we win, the competition, in which 2 history proposals were funded at a total of $25,000, whereas 4 philosophy proposals were funded at a total of $38,000. Of the $63,000 the office secured then in 1958, our friend Carnap scooped up a full $25,000 towards his probability book. He had asked for $74,800. He didn't get that, but that was crazy. For those of you interested in such things, the other funded philosophy proposals were Ernest Adams at Berkeley for work on the theory of measurement, Richard Martin at Penn for work in logic, and Adolf Grunbaum at Lehigh for work in philosophy of physics. The following year, the NSF panel, for your information, this is my interesting anecdote, take it for what it's worth. The following year, 1959, the NSF panel turned down Herbert Feigl and also a young philosopher, Norwood Russell Hanson, who proposed to do work on the discovery of the positron. Good to see that the panel wasn't particularly prescient even in the earliest days. Throughout the 1950s, Frank was a leader of the PSA. He was basically on the governing board for the entirety of the 1950s as president and past president. His retirement was celebrated thanks to the good graces of Jerry Holton with a joint conference with fellow retiree, the Nobel laureate Percy Bridgman. Frank's own paper, which I've already mentioned at the retirement conference, was commented upon by J. Robert Oppenheimer. It's a very interesting comment I urge everyone to read it. If this is marginalization, I don't know where the center is. Carnap, but. Or if Frank's on the margin, then where's the rest of us? We're not even on the page. Reich needs Frank to have been marginalized in American philosophy of science because, according to Reich, Frank is the leading representative of a more Neuratian logical empiricism on American soil. Frank's version of logical empiricism is thus, on Reich's accounting, political in a way that Carnap's, Feigel's, or Hempel's was not. Now, I have a hard time understanding a lot of recent work in history of philosophy of science on the political aspects of various projects in 20th century logical empiricist philosophy of science. I certainly, this shows my limitations as a political thinker, I guess. I certainly have not been able to follow an idea that has been taken to be canonical in some of the recent literature, namely that the distinction that Carnap informally and briefly drew in his intellectual autobiography between a left and right wing of the Vienna Circle is actually interpretatively important, because the left wing of the Vienna Circle had an intrinsically political philosophy of science and the right wing didn't. I think my problem is a Carnapian problem. Many of my problems are Carnapian problems. I don't know what political means in this context. Or more properly, it is a Carnapo-historiographic problem. You can use that term yourself at home. I know neither what political means nor whether it is meant to be an analytic term that we as historians use to make sense of the actors' philosophies, or it's meant to be an actors' category. I think we're all over the map on that issue. Now, it is true that the details of the rejection of metaphysics are different between Carnap and Frank does have, in consequence, both a greater interest in and role for history of science and the pragmatics of science, which is the empirical study of how decisions actually get made in science, than did Carnap, although the term pragmatics of science is Carnap's. And Carnap is more interested than Frank in developing the detailed tools of semantic and logical analysis for the reconstruction of science. But there isn't anything really for Carnap or Reichenbach, to choose a figure who routinely gets put in as an honorary right-wing Vienna Circle member, to disagree with in the claim that social values can, and must close the gap between evidence and theory choice, given the underdetermination problem. And indeed, when he argues for these claims, Frank cites Carnap and Reichenbach. Nor would Frank's vision of an empirical and decidedly non-normative pragmatics of science cause them, Carnap and Reichenbach, any real pause. Nor, I would argue, do these jointly shared views indicate there is any intrinsically political project in either science or philosophy. In particular, as far as I can tell, none of them argue for any particular set of social values as the ones that are or ought to be employed in science. The non-normativity of Frank's account is so central to it that he makes this point explicitly and emphatically at the very end of both his Validation of Scientific Theories conference paper and his 1957 textbook, which is almost word for word the same. I'm quoting now from the Validation of Science conference paper. This is Frank again. Quote, "The only way to include theory building in the general science of human behavior is to refrain from ordering scientists around and telling them what they should do, and to find out how each special purpose can be achieved by a theory. Only in this way can science as a human activity be scientifically understood and the gap between the scientific and the humanistic aspect be bridged." I interpret the obscure phrase, "to find out how each special purpose can be achieved by a theory," which is a hard phrase actually to understand, to indicate something like what Reichenbach called the advisory task of epistemology in 1938 in Experience and Prediction. We can look at the values that people actually have, both scientists and others, and consider a particular decision in science with that range of actual human values explicitly in mind, making it clear how a scientific decision would foster or hinder the pursuit of those values. This gives us no philosophical place, however, to criticize the values that people in fact have, or to promote a certain set of values because that set alone has scientific or philosophical or political bona fides. Now, it could be that Reich's invocation of political here amounts simply to this. Reich wants to draw our attention to the fact that logical empiricism was not committed to the idea that the scientist, as a scientist, stands outside his or her culture and undertakes scientific work that is wholly rational, mechanical, or methodical. This is a theme in logical empiricism, and it is probably given its best voice in Neurath and Frank, and bully for George Reich for drawing our attention to that. But this theme is in Carnap and Reichenbach also, and it was not, I take it, marginalized in the 1950s. Indeed, arguably, this theme is given its most prominent expression within Carnap's work, precisely in his work on internal and external questions in the 1950s. And for my money, among the most interesting discussions of value in science in this period occurs in Reichenbach's Rise of Scientific Philosophy of 1951. For there, Reichenbach explicitly thematizes the need for such decisions regarding scientific language or scientific theory to be joint decisions, not individual decisions. And he has interesting things to say about universalizing decisions in a community that cannot agree about values. He's got a very Kantian-sounding meta-ethics, non-cognitivist meta-ethics. But we don't want to do that here. I'm getting to the end. Here's an alternative explanation for the intellectual trajectory of logical empiricism in the United States, prefigured by some remarks made by Ernest Nagel, who've been given very short shrift here by me today. In his 1936 essay, Impressions and Appraisals of Analytical Philosophy in Europe, Part 2. Nagel, which was published in January 1936 in the Journal of Philosophy, Nagel gives an account of the social good of Vienna Circle philosophy in Vienna in terms that are very close to those in which Max Weber had, in 1918, explained the ethical good of value-free science in his Science as Vocation. So here's Nagel, quote, I did get a glimmer of insight into sociological motivations at Vienna. Professor Schlick's lectures were delivered in an enormous auditorium packed with students of both sexes, and in his seminar, a stray visitor was lucky if he did not have to sit on the windowsill. The content of the lectures, though elementary, was on a high level, and it was concerned with expounding the theory of meaning as the mode of verifying propositions. It occurred to me that although I was in a city foundering economically at a time when social reaction was in the saddle, the views presented so persuasively from the Katheter were a potent intellectual explosive. I wondered how much longer such doctrines would be tolerated in Vienna. And I thought I understood at least the partial reason for the vitality and appeal of analytic philosophy. Analytic philosophy is ethically neutral formally. Its professors do not indoctrinate their students with dogmas as to life, religion, race, or society. But analytic philosophy is the exercise of intelligence in a special field, and if the way of intelligence becomes part of the habitual nature of men, no doctrines and no institutions are safe from critical appraisals, reappraisals, unquote. Nagel is here clear that on his view, the political power of logical empiricism in Vienna in 1936, or 1935 when he was actually there, was due to the specific political and intellectual circumstances in which the Vienna Circle found itself. Rationally indefensible political institutions and obscurantist and culturally conservative metaphysical philosophy are at risk from a scientifically minded philosophy offered by Schlick. Their only defense against him would be to remove him from his post. There is, of course, a tragic prediction that one can read in this passage. Just over 6 months after its publication, Schlick was shot and killed by a deranged former student on the steps of the University of Vienna. An assassination that was celebrated in many corners of the Austrian media as being just the thing that a young man ought to do to someone like Schlick. There is a larger prediction here also. If the political institutions of their adopted American homeland and the practices of American philosophy were more rationally defensible, less obscurantist, less metaphysical, and more scientific, then the imported logical empiricism would be a less potent political explosive. I suspect that Nagel already in 1936 felt certain that the mores of American philosophers, having imbibed 50 years of pragmatism and a couple of decades of at least of other forms of scientific philosophy, the analysis of the new realists, the naturalism of the critical realists, the humanism of his own mentor Maurice Raphael Cohen, would provide a more welcoming home for Central European analytic philosophy. And of course, we might dispute this, and I'm not here offering it as the explanation, but I do think that it's quite worth trying to think more seriously through the various options here we have for thinking about the change of the political valence of logical empiricism as it came to the US. Last paragraph. Nagel continues the thought in his essay as follows. Quote, analytic philosophy has thus a double function. It provides quiet green pastures for intellectual analysis, wherein its practitioners can find refuge from a troubled world and cultivate their intellectual games with chess-like indifference to its course. And it is also a keen, shining sword helping to dispel irrational beliefs and to make evident the structure of ideas. It is at once the pastime of a recluse and a terribly serious adventure. It aims to make as clear as possible what it is we really know, unquote. I suspect that many younger scholars, and I was young once myself, who have been attracted by historical scholarship on logical empiricism have been attracted to it because of a sense that these days analytic philosophy is largely a chess game, whereas for the logical empiricists more was at stake, that for them philosophy was, as Nagel says, a terribly serious adventure. It is one great virtue of philosophy of science that it, among the branches of analytic philosophy, so it seems to me, is least likely to become little more than a philosopher's game. The seriousness of the object of our study, science, for our intellectual and cultural life, provides a break against the tendency of philosophy to evolve into empty argumentative gestures. We should be grateful then for the work that has come out of places like the Boston Center for the Philosophy and History of Science and its sister institutions, the centers at Minnesota and Pitt, the departments at Indiana and Pitt, and so forth. More particularly, we should be grateful for those who have done the hard work to create and to maintain such places. Locally, people such as Philipp Frank, Jerry Holton, Bobby Cohen, Max Wartowski, Alfred Talber, and as the center enters its second half-century, its current director, Alicia Bokolich. As Spinoza said, all things excellent are as difficult as they are rare. Done.
Understand your analysis. It's basically that these people who came from Europe basically were neutral, so in a sense ethically, and that so I knew Ernst Nagel when I was a graduate student at Columbia. Now, Ernst Nagel for me was the man who was a popularizer of symbolic logic. And it was symbolic logic that they brought, mathematical logic, which is what they brought to America. Mm-hmm. And I also knew Tarski, who essentially was a great philosopher of science as well, truth, etc. So in some basic sense, the real question about what happened is that there was a technique that was brought to the United States. It eventually it eventuated into the computer, because that's applied some mathematical logic, and therefore, in some real sense, logical empiricism was the dominant philosophy and has proved to be the most powerful philosophy ever, if the computer is the result.
Well, I wasn't talking about everything that one could talk about. I was trying to talk about this particular issue about how should we frame the question of the political nature of the project. Right. So, yes, obviously, there's very important technical machinery that's being brought to bear, which the logical empiricists, among others, are importantly engaged in. And that is, for many younger American scholars in particular, why they are interested in it. But there has arisen within the Hopos community, the history of philosophy of science community, this question of whether there's somehow some sort of rupture in a political project that was in place among the logical empiricists in Central Europe and does not translate into the American context. And I was just raising a possibility of a different sort of explanation than the one that George Reich actually gives. Because for him, it's very much a self-conscious depoliticization that comes from a Cold War context in which their own personal, very leftist views are under attack, that they present themselves as being ethically neutral, politically neutral in their work. But I'm presenting here evidence that there's at least different ways of thinking already available, at least as far back as Weber, who was, after all, Neurath's teacher, which said, you know, independently of your own personal political views, and certainly they all have their personal political views, is the project of philosophy of science itself political? And I think that's a harder question.
I didn't understand your distinction between the actual Kant and misunderstood Kant. We can never know the actual Kant. All we have is Kant's writings. And as Althusser pointed out, there are no innocent readings. There are different readings of Kant's writings, but we have no access to the actual Kant, even in the sense we have the access to a living philosopher, where we can do more than consult the text. But for someone like Kant, all we have is a reading of the writings.
No, of course. Right. So there I was being flip again. But, you know, I was speaking imprecisely, but about a view that people have who become scholars of a particular figure, right? That even if, you know, and I just use Kant because a lot of 19th century philosophy does depend a lot on Kant, and depends a lot on creative, highly creative, deeply misread versions of Kant. But, you know, this is just the mindset that you get into when you do the scholarship on particular figures. I should have said Carnap, right? It's not like I commune with the mind of Carnap, but I certainly know that the Carnap that is a figure in the sort of standard stories of the development of philosophy of science has very little to do with the Carnap who actually wrote the work. Right? And I think people inside the scholarly community who specialize in Carnap can all agree about that, even if we want to disagree about what Carnap actually said. Right? So it's, you know, I apologize for how.
It's well known that rockets by standing on the ground cause earthquakes. It's well known that those are known well. So that there's a community of agreement doesn't prove it's correct.
No, of course not. But I didn't say that either. What I said was, surely, right? Unless we begin from the idea that people who spend their time engaged in expert work in doing the history of philosophy, unless we grant them some possibility that they can actually provide better interpretations of the historical figures that they're thinking about, then we have no reason at all to do any history of philosophy. So I think it's pretty clear that you can get to a point where you understand. I mean, I take it this is not even a controversial claim, right? That there's lots of ways of thinking about what Kant must have been up to in these obscure works that were deeply influential in the 19th century and through the 20th century and into the 21st century, which don't have that much to do with what Kant was trying to do.
Well, you say better or worse, that implies some purpose. And yes, they're taking better for some purpose, you have.
Are there any other questions?
Okay, so let's go back to your argument. Basically, you have this logical empiricism. Did it have a political and sociological content? Now, you can compare that to other systems that are based on technique, such as phenomenology. And you can have the work of Husserl, who presumably was not politically or sociologically implicated, but then you have Heidegger, who essentially was politically and sociologically implicated.
Mm-hmm.
And so you can really tell whether some technique or technician is political and sociological or not.
One can tell? That's what you...
I mean, with Heidegger, it's absolutely clear.
Well,
With Carnap and these other guys, it's not clear at all. Maybe Neurath is the only guy for which it was clear.
well, no, I take it that
I'll speak for Carnap.
excellent. Let someone else speak for Carnap.
Before one of the elections, Truman was elected. Our seminar was devoted not to the subject intended, but it was devoted to the coming election. And Carnap was going to vote for Wallace. And he said, I do not expect Wallace to win, but I want to strengthen his position and will hope for the future that it will develop his ideas and develop listening to his ideas. And I admired him for it, though I still voted for Truman.
Yes, clearly there's no doubt but that Carnap had his own political convictions, and the most interesting part of this story is that he would actually talk about them in class, which is not what Weber told him to do. That the question, and it's still a question even for Heidegger, right, is the fact that Heidegger's a Nazi, shall we say, does that mean that whatever the techniques or alleged techniques of existential phenomenology are intrinsically fascist? I don't know. I don't even know if that's true for Heidegger, but it certainly, surely there are existential phenomenologists who want to say we can go about doing this business without being committed to Heidegger's particular political project, right? So there's a question, right? And it's the question that I wanted to raise for the logical empiricists that, I think that there could be evidence that's going to run in different ways for various of them, is do they think that the particular technical philosophy or scientific philosophy that they're engaged in has intrinsically a political purpose, right? And I think that opinions divide in the group, but they don't divide in the group along the lines of Carnap's reminiscences about a left and a right-wing Vienna Circle. And it's a part of this larger question of whether the progress of science is intrinsically a liberal Enlightenment project, right? And whether that means it's a political project as opposed to some other sort of social project. As I say, it's hard to know quite in some of these conversations what we're even talking about because I don't know what it is to ask the question, is this political? As opposed to somehow does it embody some sort of social values?
Please join me in thanking.